Hey, so everyone paid subscribers on my Substack get to send me their questions, and I do my best to respond to them. And today we have our very first question and my very first response. So let's see how it will go. And they are a very thoughtful question. I think it is sent in by Linda, and it says, "Who is someone you admire for their bravery?" Well, that is a great question, and I really had to think about that one and think because there are so many different ways you could go with that question. Like, what is bravery? What is being brave? What does that really mean? So I had to really think about this. And I am going to give a very specific answer to this question. But first, I'm kind of going to give a broad overview. I think I admire anybody who is brave in the face of death. Now, this doesn't mean they're not afraid. This doesn't mean that they're not angry about their fate or sad, but it just means they have a resolve about them because they understand that death is not the final word. And it's been said, most recently quoted by former Senator Ben Sass, I believe, who is dying of cancer right now. He was quoted as saying death is the last great enemy. I think part of what makes that scary is we really don't know how we will react to it until we face it. I guess we could say anything we want now, and it doesn't mean we're lying. It doesn't mean we don't feel a certain way now, but you never know until you get there what your reaction will be, what your emotion will be. And I think that's kind of a scary thought. So I admire anybody who, once they get to that doorstep, faces it with courage. And this goes all the way back to the Old Testament with people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who faced the fiery furnace and they did what was right and they told the king, we know God will save us, but even if he doesn't, we're still gonna do the right thing. And I think, man, imagine, like, we read that as just a little Bible story, okay, in kids' stories, and we see, like, the three of them dancing in the flames, and they're kind of cute, but just imagine that. Imagine being on the doorstep of a fiery furnace about to be thrown in, and you say, okay, like, that takes courage, that takes bravery, that takes understanding of God, that brings you peace, and like even also Daniel and the lion. Then another story in that book where Daniel gets thrown in the lion den. Like, I don't know what I would do if I was faced in that scenario. That is a horrific way to die. And then when you think about the New Testament and even as the church scattered and began to grow, you have Stephen being stoned to death who forgave his offenders. I mean, that is unbelievable. And as the church grew and Rome saw them as a bigger threat, you hear more horrific stories. Christians being burned alive, again, affected lives. And anybody who faced that, again, it doesn't mean they weren't scared. It doesn't mean they weren't trembling on the inside or the outside. But they faced it anyway because they knew that death wasn't the final word and that God's kingdom was coming. Even now, in certain parts of the world, Nigeria, North Korea, same thing happens to people. And I would be remiss to say that it doesn't just happen to Christians either, right? It happens to other people in other countries, even in other religions. They get persecuted simply for believing in something, and they face death. I think anybody who is able to face that, I really admire their courage and their bravery. Now, for a very specific example in my own life, I want to say someone who I admire for this is my grandmother, my mom's mom, who died the day after Christmas in 2012. My grandmother was 82 years old, and she was diagnosed with cancer in early 2010. So she fought hard for 2.5 years. She did the chemo, she did the treatment, and she fought very hard because she wanted to live, and man, she did live. My grandmother was so full of joy. She was from New York, the Bronx, so very tough lady. she would she would walk the streets with her friends. They would hang out at the ice cream shop and talk and man, people loved her and she just loved people. And maybe about 2 years into the treatment, we could see she was worn out by it, and she was worn out by it, and she decided to stop doing chemo and just live out the rest of her days. No matter how long she had. And that was a very tough time for our family, but it was also, we saw blessings in that time. My grandmother loved to play cards, so I would play cards with her, and we would just make jokes and tell funny stories and laugh. And she very rarely ever complained or said, why me or anything, but she really kept her faith in God. And one thing I'll never forget, like the night before she died, it was Christmas Day. At this point, she was very weak. She was barely eating. She was not really good. She was in and out of being coherent. She didn't talk much. But I remember being in her room. She was staying at our house for those 2.5 years. And my sister was reading her a psalm from the Bible. She was reading my grandmother's psalms. And I don't remember really what song it was. I could probably look it up. But it ended with Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. And after my sister said that, my grandmother said, okay. And it wasn't like a okay, like a resigned okay, but it was a hopeful okay. And, again, the whole Substack is called A Walk with Jesus Down Hope Road. And man, I felt like when my grandmother said okay, it was full of a hope. Like she wasn't going to let death bring her down. She was still praising God. She was still a believer. She really used one of her last breaths to continue that prayer of praise. And then a few hours later, the next morning, she did pass away. I think that was bravery in the face of death. And like I said, we never know how we're gonna react until we get there. But I do hope I could have that spirit of courage whenever it's my time. So thank you, Nando, for that question. It was a very good question. And I'm kind of curious about you guys. Who is someone you admire for their bravery? Let me know. And hey, if you like this kind of content, if you would like to submit a question to me to possibly respond to, then please consider being a paid subscriber of A Walk with Jesus Down Hope Road. And you could get a free 3-month trial if you haven't already at hoperoad.substack.com/free trial. I'll see you next time.